we're going to begin by my having a camera attached to me, and while Paul's doing it, I'll tell you the genesis of this idea. So all this is part of our presentation. And I was walking the other day and just sort of became aware of my arm moving my coat sleeve. You'd think after 63 years, the novelty of that would have gone. And then the idea came into my head to strap a camera to the stump of my left arm. It's a bit, you know, the cricket term, stump height, isn't it? To strap a camera to the stump of my left arm, because it then occurred to me that when I'm talking, and particularly if I get absorbed in the process of talking, I tend to wave my arms around. I wave this arm around, you see. And Paul's a photographer who works with me a lot, and his concerns are really photographic. And he said to me, but Mike, if you've got this camera strapped to your arm and you're waving your arm around, the image is going to be very hard for people to look at. And I thought, well, that's a nice relief. Because one of the things that happened to me when I was growing up, I think, it's very interesting because we grew up in Queensland, and my family were born in, or lived in Sydney and were born here. But after the war, my father moved us all to Queensland to a farm, to absolute isolation, and he'd come back from the war quite unsettled. And so we were on the farm, and this was the 1950s, early 1950s. And really we were surrounded by hillbillies. And I think when I was growing up, I became very isolated. I got very tired of people looking at me all the time and sort of asking questions. And they do it in the most brusque and sort of confronting way. You know, what happened to your arm, mate? And, you know, I tried to explain. So I thought I might call this film Dogs Don't Notice, because when I was growing up I really became very fond of dogs because they never asked me any questions. So it was an enormous relief to just be walking around the bush and generally being on the farm in the company of dogs, and it's persisted really. I really like dogs. So we'll see what happens. We might end up with a little film. Now, I'm going to try and talk about the installation today. All my work, in a way, I mean, there's a lot of very personal things happening upstairs in that installation. But I'm very interested in the crossover between intensely personal things and a sort of politics of reception. I was just round seeing Mark Boulos's. He's got a wonderful piece in this Biennale, but this is what I noticed. What I noticed was there's the black Ugandans are trying to defend their rights, as it were, to the oil and to their land in the Niger Delta. And in contrast, we've got the Chicago Stock Exchange. But what I really noticed was the peculiar, it's not symmetrical, it's homologous behaviour. It's equal and opposite. It's opposite because of a political contest. But at the level of primate behaviour, it's absolutely equal. And you may have noticed that the artist is very aware of this, that both films rise to a kind of climax, where the people in the Chicago Stock Exchange acting out in the most kind of compulsive way, you know. It's extraordinary body language, and the let's call them the freedom fighters are behaving in much the same way in terms of body language. It's a kind of it's a group reinforcing behaviour, and they're saying, we will kill the whites, let's go and kill the whites. And the Chicago Stock Exchange people are not bothering to say, let's go and kill the blacks, but in point of fact, that's what they're doing. But the behaviour at the level of waving arms around and body language is absolutely symmetrical. So for me, this is enormously revealing immediately, because we then go to Vernon Ali's wonderful nomination with these miasmic toilets filled with sort of xenophobia and racism and homophobia and sexism. The whole catalogue of disorders is there. And I noticed one lone voice suggesting that perhaps we should saying, well, look, let's stop this racism and let's realise that the real problem is money, is capitalist finance. It's a typical Marxist rhetoric, but it's very heartfelt. And he's saying, let's stop this racist talk and so on. This is written in the toilet. Someone's written alongside it, Soviet spy. So this for me is the problem of the political, that it can become a sort of theatre. And I don't know whether I'm allowed to say this, but I will anyway. The black Ellery, sorry, I've just forgotten his name in the stress of all of this.
Emery Douglas?
Yes. With the Black Panther newspapers, they're very interesting to read the captioning on these, you know. It's sort of talking about, you know, sort of the violence of the pigs and let us, you know, take our rights back, and the man on the cover is holding a gun. So violence produces these symmetrically violent responses. So the origins of my thinking are in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and I've never felt the need to completely revise my influences from that period. And they were sort of Wilhelm Reich, who wrote a fascinating book in 1933 where he completely anticipated what happened in Central Europe, and it was called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And he talked about the working class, and the German working class, and he anticipated that the authoritarianism of the German working class would inevitably see them defect to the right. And of course they did. So he tried to analyse this phenomena in terms of psychoanalysis. So I've remained very interested and anxious about the political in some ways. I'm virulently political and always have been, but it's also the politics of the personal that concern me, because my own compensations make me frail in terms of political certitude. So I need to introspect about the atavistic dimensions of the political urge. So this installation is in a way all about that. And then I must say something else that, and I'm always drawing on immediate experiences. I seem to rock from one encounter to the next. At a dinner party or lunch party the other day, in fact it was put on by, and I'm not going to disclose anything, it was fine. I mean, an old friend, Bernice Murphy, was sitting opposite him. She's known me for 20 years, 25 years. And she said to me, Mike, I want to criticise that installation you've done on Cockatoo Island. And I said, well, go ahead, everyone's listening. Go ahead. And Bernice said, you violated your own work. And I was amazed at this. I must say, I was amazed at this, because violating my own work is what I do. And I suddenly realised that we in the art world continually regress to familiar patterns, you know, that I've always had a kind of, I've always had a rhetoric against sort of formalism. It's just my experience of formalist configurations in art. Because I've always experienced the formalist configuration as somehow or other frozen. There's many ways in which you can, with multiple receptions for art, but we tend to get channeled into particular receptions. But I've always found the reductions of modernism to be a little bit like an experimental refrigerator, because they put psychological states into a sort of deep freeze. So I've always resisted these, and the basis for my performance work has often been quite ironical and ridiculous assaults on these configurations, like the one where I put the tacks into my leg and train myself to do it very accurately every inch or so, straight up my leg. So what you were encouraged to do was to look at a virtuoso act of measurement and placement, but it was problematized because this wasn't just a piece of stretched canvas, this was the human body. So all my work, in a way, has been about sort of acting out quite a rigorous sort of formalist container and then worrying about the outcome. So what this means is that all those performances that you see upstairs begin as statements, and some of those statements go right back to the early 1970s. You know, nail your hand to a tree. That's a very alarming proposition. And all those statements, I tried very hard at the time that I wrote the statements, because I wasn't doing performance at that very point, because this is 1971-72. I was only beginning to do performance. These were ideas that came into my head that seemed often quite hilarious in their excessiveness. And in their excessiveness of impulse, I would try to reduce them to a fairly elegant written form, to just sort of stop them. And then later I got to the point where I decided to perform these things. And then later still I got to the point where I decided to perform and film these things. But the thing I want to say is that there's absolutely no equivalence, or there's no exact equivalence, between the statement, the performance, and the film. And that process of sort of, not recapitulation, but that process of sort of displacement is where the thinking begins. So I was astonished at this response from an old friend, because violating my own work has been the basis for all of it. And I suddenly realised then what the real risk was, that art in a way is a sort of sanctuary that's pre-structured and which, you know, always invites a regression back according to its established categories. But what's marvellous about this Biennale is that nearly all of the work, in one way or another, proposes sort of limit states, which in their own way violate our notions of what art is. All of them challenge the idea of what art is. I mean, go right back to Tanguy. I mean, his exploding homage to New York challenges the idea of sculpture. So it's a moment in which a deliberate failure of aesthetics and art language is enacted for the sake of new possibilities. But it means that people clamber to re-establish a new kind of coherence out of this sort of Visigoth assault on what they already know and expect. And that takes time, and then it leads to new developments in art, like Arte Povera, where all kinds of random materials can be accumulated, or Smithson's version of this, where he piled up heaps of rubble and dumped gravel over the edge of the shoulders of roads to create spills down into the gullies. This was declared as art. So this Biennale catalogues all of this. But my work is a little bit different, because it tries to create fairly charged and anxious interfaces between quite oblique personal awarenesses of incompletion and the possibility for openness within the structure of art. And I play one off against the other, and I'm alive to sort of the politics of this. I think this is very important because I think the political, I think the performative is a kind of theatre. This is a kind of mutilated theatre. But the political often invites a sort of overt theatre. I'm back to my Black Panthers. I'm giving them a hard time today. But, early on I was sort of long hair and beards and things, but I'm not very successful at that really anyway. So all that went. So I don't go with the dreadlocks and sort of the ferocious persona and the sort of annihilating rhetoric, at least at the political level, because I think that theatre can kind of quickly subsume all of the exigent, they're impoverished contents of the actual situation, and these need all kinds of negotiations, and they need negotiations at the level of gender, and they need the negotiations at the level of power, not just as a cohesive group confronting what they consider to be the injustices of the system, but the way establishing that power can completely oppress the group itself and its dynamic and its relationships with family and friends and husbands and wives and so on. So this, I just wanted to say this sort of inframents, this was Duchamp's term, that he was a dandy, of course, so he imagined someone walking in velvet trousers, and then he had to imagine the noise that velvet trousers rubbing together might make. So my inframents isn't as acutely calibrated as Duchamp's, but nevertheless I am really interested in these sort of interstices and these little sort of dumbnesses and things that can't be translated. I was listening on the radio driving last week, I just remember a very interesting and witty rejoinder. And it was a Swiss conductor, I don't know who his name, I just turned the radio on and then I was in the maelstrom of traffic and my life was at risk, so I turned the radio off again. But I turned the radio on and he was visiting Australia and he was introducing a concert, items in a concert to an audience somewhere here, maybe here in Sydney. I don't know who it was. His English was pretty good. So I mentioned that because later I can bring that to a point. He was trying to introduce Schoenberg and he was saying, I can't say what this piece means. I can't say what it means, but what's interesting about this piece is that the 12-tone system means we're working with extraordinary equivalences at the level of sound. And he went on to talk about these equivalences, and he went to talk on, about Schoenberg, and he said that Schoenberg imagined that in 50 years' time, people would be whistling his atonal constructions in the street. He said, in this instance, I think, or I fear, that Schoenberg may have been wrong. But he ended what he had to say by remarking that you'll please excuse my 12-tone English. And what I want to say now, finally, before you ask me some questions, because I'm just taking into account, I think, before I answer your questions, the possibility that I may not be able to do so effectively, that all art, in a way, produces a kind of 12-tone English. The certitudes of the mother tongue are dragged into a profound uncertainty, I think, by the act of visual art. And that seems right, because if you could say it all clearly, it would be entirely unnecessary to make the work itself. And I remember that a most moving moment in Beckett's the great playwright, of course, in his history was, and I can remember reading a biography by Cronin and talking about the time that he was in Ireland, and he had a terrible time because he was trying to write and he was constantly blocked, and it led to all sorts of embarrassing physical conditions, which I won't go into. But when he decided to leave for France, he left behind the mother tongue. And much of what we know of Beckett, certainly of his theatre, was produced in France while he was learning French. So learning a new language released the real possibilities of his art. And you've got to remember that's a salutary reminder when it comes to trying to talk about visual art. Now, I really would like to take some questions because I want you to ask me now, and to grill me in unrelenting fashion, of course, about the experience upstairs.